More than 12,000 people had died in the decade-long conflict in northern Sahara, Burkina Faso. Ibrahim Traoré knew that military solutions had failed. Without telling anyone unprotected, he set out into the desert to meet one of the world's most dangerous terrorist leaders. The morning began like any other in Ouagadougou. President Ibrahim Traoré. Intelligence reports over a simple breakfast in his quarters at the presidential compound. The documents painted a grim picture. Another village attacked, 23. Civilians killed, infrastructure destroyed. The pattern had repeated for years across northern Burkina Faso, with government forces seemingly powerless to stop it. Traoré set the reports aside and walked to the window. In the distance, he could see the city awakening, street vendors setting up. Children in uniforms heading to schools, life continuing despite the shadow of violence that had plagued the nation for over a decade. Since taking power, he had tried everything to end the insurgency. Increased military presence, community outreach, economic development in affected regions. Nothing had worked the previous night. He had received an unexpected message through an elderly imam who had somehow gained access to the presidential compound. The religious leader had approached him after an official function and pressed a folded paper into his hand. From Muhammad El-Ghazawi, the imam had whispered before disappearing into the crowd. El-Ghazawi, the mere mention of the name sent a chill through the security establishment. Leader of the Shadow of the Sahel, the most brutal insurgent group, operating across the border regions of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, responsible for countless atrocities, a ghost who had evaded capture for years despite international manhunts. The note had been brief. Meet me alone. Tomorrow. Bring no weapons, no guards. Coordinates enclosed. A chance for peace. Any reasonable security assessment would declare it a trap. Traoré's advisors would unanimously forbid him from going. International allies would call it madness. Yet, as he watched his city come to life in the morning light, Traoré made his decision. 10 minutes later, he left his quarters dressed in simple civilian clothes, khaki pants, a light cotton shirt. No symbols of office. He told his chief of staff he was taking a personal day to visit his childhood village and needed no security detail, a half-truth that bought him the day. Instead of his official vehicle, he took an unmarked jeep from the motor pool. The guard at the gate barely glanced at him, accustomed to the president's unconventional style and preference for occasional solitude. Once outside the capital, Traoré drove north. The landscape gradually transformed from the lush green of the south to the arid semi-desert of the north. He knew these roads well from his time as a military officer before becoming president. Each village he passed reminded him of the human cost of the conflict-abandoned homes. Security checkpoints, the weary eyes of residents who had seen too much violence. 6 hours later, he approached the coordinates specified in the Nota remote area near the Mali border. A no-man's land that government forces rarely entered. He parked the jeep by a cluster of acacia trees and waited. Minutes stretched into an hour. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly. Traoré remained in the vehicle, doubts beginning to creep in. Had he been lured away from the capital for some other purpose? Was an attack being launched while he sat in the desert? Then he saw them 3 pickup trucks approaching from the north, dust clouds billowing behind them. As they drew closer, he could make out the black flags that had become synonymous. With terror across the Sahel, men with covered faces and assault rifles stood in the beds of the trucks. It was too late to reconsider. Traoré stepped out of his vehicle, empty hands raised slightly to show he was unarmed. The trucks formed a semicircle around him, engines idling. Armed men jumped down, creating a perimeter. From the center vehicle, a tall figure emerged. Unlike his men, Muhammad El-Ghazawi's face was uncovered. He was younger than Traoré had expected, perhaps in his late 30s, with a closely trimmed beard and penetrating eyes that had seen their share of conflict. He wore traditional desert attire, but carried himself with the bearing of someone who had received military training. President Traoré El-Ghazawi said, his voice carrying across the space between them. I did not expect you to come alone. And yet you asked me to, Traoré replied evenly. A test one you've passed, El-Ghazawi responded. He gestured to a small tent that Traoré hadn't noticed earlier, set up beneath a lone acacia tree several meters away. "Shall we speak out of this heat?" The two men walked toward the tent, surrounded by watchful fighters. Inside was simple too. Cushions on a carpet, a small table with water and tea. Nothing else. They sat facing each other, two leaders from opposing worlds. "Why did you request this meeting?" Traoré asked directly. El-Ghazawi poured 2 glasses of water, offering one to Traoré. "Because after 10 years of fighting, neither of us is winning. Your forces cannot eliminate us, cannot overthrow your government. Meanwhile, our people suffer." Our people, Traoré noted the choice of words. "So you still consider yourself Burkina? Was born in Djibouti," El-Ghazawi confirmed, naming a town in northern Burkina Faso. "Studied engineering in Ouagadougou. Before the first government crackdown in 2014, my brother was arrested, tortured, killed, though he had no connections to any militant groups. That path was chosen for me by your predecessors." Traoré nodded slowly. He had heard similar stories countless times, the radicalization of young men following heavy-handed security operations by previous regimes. "Now what path do you choose for yourself?" El-Ghazawi studied him for a moment before responding. "That depends on what you offer. Not to me personally, but to the people of the north of forgotten ones." For the next hour, they spoke candidly about the conflicts. Root causes. El-Ghazawi described the northern community's grievances: marginalization by the central government, lack of basic services, heavy-handed military responses, foreign military presence that many viewed as neo-colonial occupation. Traoré listened. More than he spoke, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated his understanding of the region's complex dynamics. He had grown up in similar circumstances, in a village that had seen its share of hardship. The difference was that he had channeled his frustrations into military service and eventually political leadership rather than insurgency. "Your movement's tactics, attacking civilians, destroying schools, how do these help the people you claim to represent?" Traoré finally asked. El-Ghazawi's expression hardened. "Some attacks attributed to us were committed by others. Some were committed by commanders I could not control. And some," he paused, "some were strategic. When foreign teachers replace Quranic education, when NGOs bring foreign values, when government buildings represent oppression, these become targets. Children have died," Traoré said simply. "Children die from lack of clean water, from preventable diseases, from poverty every day in the north," El-Ghazawi countered. "Where was the government's concern before they became casualties in headlines?" The conversation continued, tense but productive. Neither man conceded moral high ground entirely, yet both acknowledged failures on their sides. As the afternoon waned, Traoré shifted the discussion. "What would it take for the shadow of the Sahel to lay down arms?" Ghazawi leaned back, considering the question. 3 things. First, removal of all French military presence from Burkina Faso. Second, genuine autonomy for the northern region's control over local governance, education, resource management. Third, amnesty for my fighters and a place at the table in national reconciliation talks. Traoré had expected the first demand. His own government had already begun reducing foreign military presence. The second was complicated, but potentially negotiable. The third would be politically explosive. "And in return?" he asked. "Immediate ceasefire, release of all hostages, gradual disarmament, integration of those fighters who wish to join regular forces. My personal commitment to peace." "Your personal commitment," Traoré repeated. "Can you control all factions within your movement?" El-Ghazawi's hesitation was telling. 80% immediately. The rest will follow when they see the benefits of peace. Those who refuse, they become outlaws to both sides. Outside the tent, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. Traoré realized they had been talking for nearly 3 hours. "I cannot make these decisions alone," he said finally. "Nor can I offer guarantees without proper process. But I can begin the work. I cannot trust mere words from a government." "Figure," El-Ghazawi replied. "We have heard promises before." Traoré considered this, then made an unprecedented offer. "What if we begin with a localized ceasefire? 1 province, 30 days. You withdraw your fighters, Withdraw heavy military presence. Joint community patrols, your men and mine working together. We bring in development resources, start rebuilding infrastructure. A test case. El-Ghazawi's expression remained impassive, but his eyes showed interest. Which province? Your choice. Ain't this surprised the insurgent leader? After a moment's thought, he said, Sumai, home province. Traoré nodded. It was one of the hardest hit regions, a stronghold of insurgent activity. Choosing it demonstrated seriousness on both sides. 1 month, beginning next week, Traoré. Confirmed. If it holds, we expand to neighboring provinces. If it fails, we both know this was our only chance, T. They discussed implementation details as darkness fell, how to communicate, how to manage potential spoilers, how to keep foreign interests, particularly France, from undermining the fragile process. As they concluded, Traoré made one final request. Before I leave, I want to meet some of your fighters too, hear directly from them. El-Ghazawi appeared surprised but agreed. Outside, he called over 3 men of varying ages. The oldest, perhaps 50, had been a farmer before government forces burned his village, suspecting insurgent support. The middle-aged man had been a teacher until schools closed due to the conflict. The youngest, barely 20, had known nothing but war for most of his life. Traoré spoke with each briefly, asking about their experiences, their hopes. Their stories reinforced what he already knew. This conflict had complex roots that military force alone could never address as he prepared. To leave, El-Ghazawi approached him one last time. You took an enormous risk coming here, the insurgent leader said. Why? Traoré looked out at the desert night, stars emerging in the vast sky above. Because someone had to break the cycle. Too many have died while we talked about talking. El-Ghazawi extended his hand, a gesture both simple and profound. In 30 days, we will know if this was wisdom or folly. Traoré accepted the handshake. Either way, we will have tried what has not been tried before. The drive back to Ouagadougou was long and solitary, giving Traoré time to contemplate the enormity of what had just transpired and what lay ahead. By the time he reached the capital near dawn, he had formulated a plan for moving forward without causing immediate political chaos. He entered the presidential compound through a side entrance, hoping to reach his quarters before anyone noted his absence. He was not successful. Mr. President, the voice belonged to Colonel Ouedraogo, his head of security, who stood in the darkened corridor with a concerned expression. You've been gone for 24 hours. No communication, no security detail. Traoré had expected this confrontation. I needed time alone, Colonel, to think. With respect, sir, that is not acceptable. We've been on high alert. There are protocols. Protocols that I set, Traoré interrupted gently, and that I can modify when necessary. Ouedraogo studied him closely. You weren't at your village. We checked. Rather than lie further, Traoré made a decision. Walk with me, Colonel. What I'm about to tell you cannot leave the two of us for now. Okay. In his private office, secure from listening devices, Traoré revealed the outlines of his meeting with El-Ghazawi. As expected, Ouedraogo was initially shocked, then furious. At the risk Traoré had taken. It was a calculated decision, Traoré explained calmly. If I had been killed, Vice President Kabore would have continued our policies. But if we succeeded, thousands of lives could be saved. And did you succeed? Ouedraogo asked, skepticism evident. We've agreed to a 30-day ceasefire in Soum province beginning next week. A test case for potential wider peace. Ouedraogo shook his head in disbelief. The military will resist. The French will undermine it. The public will be divided. All true, Traoré acknowledged. Which is why we need to approach this carefully. No public announcements yet. Quietly redeploy forces, monitor the situation, prepare contingencies. If it fails, we've lost little. If it shows promise, he left the sentence unfinished, the implications clear. Over the next few days, Traoré held confidential briefings with his most trusted advisors, the defense minister, intelligence chief, and foreign minister. Reactions ranged from cautious optimism to outright opposition, but Traoré's authority prevailed. Careful orders were issued for a strategic redeployment in Soum. province language vague enough to avoid immediate questions. 6 days after his desert meeting, Traoré received a text message from an unknown number. The hawks are in their nests. The doves may fly. It was El-Ghazawi's confirmation that his fighters had withdrawn from offensive positions. That same day, Traoré ordered the removal of heavy artillery and reduction of military presence in key areas of Soum. He replaced them with a newly formed community security unit, regular soldiers paired with local volunteers, focusing on protection. Rather than offensive operations, the first week passed in tense silence. Both sides expected betrayal, a resumption of violence. It didn't come by the second week. Residents of Soum began to notice the change. Markets reopened. Farmers returned to fields long abandoned. Children played outside again. In the third week, Traoré took his boldest step yet without public announcement. He traveled to Djibo, the provincial capital of Soum, that had been under virtual siege for years. He brought with him engineers, medical staff, and resources for immediate infrastructure repair. The local population was stunned to see the president walking freely through their streets, listening to their concerns directly. What they didn't know was that the night before, El-Ghazawi had also been in Djibo. His remaining fighters maintained the ceasefire, engaging community response. The two leaders never met in public, but a secure phone line kept them in communication as the experiment unfolded. By the fourth week, news of the dramatic changes in Soum had begun spreading throughout Burkina Faso. Journalists questioned the shift in military posture. Opposition politicians demanded explanations. Foreign embassies, particularly the French, expressed concern over what they termed a security vacuum. It was time to go public. On the 28th day of the ceasefire, Traoré addressed the nation from Djibo itself. A powerful symbolic choice. With local leaders from diverse ethnic and religious backgrounds standing behind him, he revealed the outlines of what had transpired. 1 month ago, I took an unprecedented step in search of peace, he began, his voice steady. I met directly with Muhammad El-Ghazawi, leader of the Shadow of the Sahel movement. Audible gasps could be heard from the assembled journalists. This was not a surrender, nor a negotiation with terrorism. It was a recognition that after 10 years of conflict and 12,000 deaths, military solutions alone have failed. It was an attempt to break the cycle of violence that has destroyed communities across our north. He went on to describe the localized ceasefire, presenting it as a Burkina solution to a Burkina problem. He emphasized that no foreign powers had been consulted, a deliberate jab at the French, whose counter-terrorism operations had often exacerbated tensions. For 28 days, not a single civilian has died from conflict in Soum province. Markets have reopened. Schools are preparing to resume. This is not yet peace, but it is a glimpse of what peace could look like. Traoré then announced the expansion of the model to 2 neighboring provinces with a clear framework: gradual military redeployment, joint community security units, accelerated development projects, and local governance reforms addressing long-standing grievances. To those fighters still in the bush, I say this: there is a path home. Not through amnesty for crimes against civilians. Justice must still be served, but through a process of disarmament, reintegration, and reconciliation that recognizes the complex roots of this conflict. The speech was met with a mixture of hope, skepticism, and outrage. Military hardliners condemned negotiating with terrorists. Opposition parties accused Traoré of endangering national security. The French embassy issued a statement expressing serious reservations about the approach. But in the streets of Djibo, something remarkable happened. As Traoré walked among the people after his speech, an elderly woman approached him, took his hands in hers, and simply said, "My grandson can sleep through the night now without fear. Thank you." That evening, on the secure line, El-Ghazawi provided his own assessment. "Your speech was well received in our communities, but there are challenges ahead. Foreign fighters are arriving from Mali, sent by those who profit from chaos. They will try to break this peace." "And your control over your forces?" Traoré asked. Holding but strained. "They need to see tangible benefits, sun jobs, development, dignity. Words alone won't sustain this." Traoré understood the fragility of what they had begun. one step at a time. Tomorrow we begin the expansion to Ouadalen and Yaga provinces. Your fighters there, they have their orders. No attacks. Maintain defensive positions only. Allow development teams to enter. The next 3 months tested the framework repeatedly. Twice, rogue elements within the insurgency attacked government positions. Each time, El-Ghazawi's loyalists helped identify and neutralize the perpetrators. Once, an overzealous military commander ordered an unauthorized raid on a suspected insurgent hideout. Traoré had him immediately reassigned. Gradually, the experiment expanded to 5 provinces, then 8. Not without setbacks. Violence still erupted. Trust remained fragile. Foreign interests continued attempting to undermine the process, but a pattern emerged where the framework was implemented. Civilian casualties dropped by over 80%, economic activity resumed, and communities began the long process of healing. 6 months after his desert meeting with El-Ghazawi, Traoré took the most controversial step yet. He invited the insurgent leader to participate in nationally televised peace talks in Ouagadougou. The invitation sparked protests from victims groups, resignations from 2 cabinet ministers, and a stern diplomatic note from France. Yet Traoré persisted. When El-Ghazawi arrived in the capital under heavy security, and having laid down his weapons as agreed, it marked the first time in African history that an active insurgent leader had been brought into a formal peace process without first being defeated militarily. The talks were difficult, emotional, and often nearly collapsed. Victims confronted perpetrators. Religious and ethnic tensions flared. The military establishment resisted compromises on security arrangements. International observers questioned whether lasting peace was possible given the deep divides. On the talk's 3rd day, during a particularly heated exchange about accountability for atrocities, a young woman stood up in the audience. She identified herself as having lost her entire family to an insurgent attack 2 years earlier. "Have every reason to want vengeance," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "But what would that bring back? Not my parents, not my brothers, not my village." She looked directly at El-Ghazawi. "I do not forgive what was done, but I want the killing to stop. I want other families to remain whole." Her intervention changed the tenor of the proceedings. Discussions shifted from recrimination to practical solutions for sustained peace-security arrangements. Development priorities, governance reforms, and mechanisms for justice that balanced accountability with reconciliation. After 2 weeks of intense negotiations, the Ouagadougou Accord was signed. Not a perfect document. Not a complete solution, but a framework that could evolve. Its core principles included removal of foreign military bases, decentralized governance for northern regions, integration of former insurgents into community security forces, and a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. As El-Ghazawi signed the document officially ending his status as Burkina Faso's most wanted terrorist and beginning his new role as part of a transitional Northern Governance Council, he exchanged a brief look with Traoré. In that moment passed the unspoken acknowledgement of how unlikely their journey had been, from mortal enemies to cautious partners in peace. 1 year after the secret desert meeting that had started it all, Ibrahim Traoré stood on the outskirts of a village in Soum province that had been abandoned for years due to the conflict. Now it hummed with life, homes being rebuilt, fields cultivated, a school in session. Next to him stood Muhammad El-Ghazawi, no longer an insurgent leader, but still a complex and controversial figure in the country's evolving story. "Did you believe this was possible?" Traoré asked quietly, "when you sent that note asking to meet?" El-Ghazawi considered the question. "I believed it was necessary to try. After burying enough fighters and seeing enough civilians suffer, even the most committed warrior questions the path of perpetual conflict." They watched as children played in the village centered their laughter, a sound that had been absent from this region for too long. "The peace remains fragile," Traoré acknowledged. "There are still attacks, still distrust, still foreign interests trying to destabilize what we've built." "Yes," El-Ghazawi agreed. "But each month it holds, is a month that rebuilds trust. Each school that reopens, each market that thrives, each family that returns home, these strengthen the foundations. What neither man said aloud, but both understood, was that their unconventional approach had fundamentally changed the narrative of conflict resolution in the region. For decades, the only models had been either total military victory rarely achieved, or superficial negotiations that failed to address root causes. Their third path, difficult, dangerous, imperfect, something different, a locally owned process that recognized the complexity of modern conflicts and the need for solutions. That went beyond military force. As they walked through the reviving village, a group of elders approached to greet them. One, a woman in her 70s, spoke with the directness that often comes with age. "You two brought back our homes," she said, looking between the president and the former insurgent. "But the road ahead remains long. Will you continue walking it together?" Question hung in the air between them, embodying the uncertainty of their nation's future. Both men had taken enormous personal and political risks. Both had been changed by the process. Both faced opposition from within their own constituencies. "The alternative is to return to a conflict neither side can win," Traoré replied finally. "For the sake of these children, we must find a way forward." El-Ghazawi nodded in agreement. "The guns have fallen silent in much of our land. Now comes the harder task, building a peace that lasts beyond personalities, beyond politics." Sun set over the village, casting long shadows across the recovering landscape. Traoré reflected on the improbable journey that had begun with his solitary drive into the desert 1 year earlier. A single conversation had not solved all of Burkina Faso's problems. Violence still erupted in parts of the country. Political opposition remained fierce. Foreign powers continued their attempts to influence events, yet something fundamental had shifted. A nation that had resigned itself to endless conflict had glimpsed an alternative. Communities that had been divided by violence were slowly reknitting their social fabric, a process owned by Burkina themselves, not imposed by foreign consultants or dictated by international institutions, was evolving according to local needs and realities. It had begun with a simple recognition. Even the most intractable conflicts ultimately require adversaries to see each other's humanity, to excuse violence or erase accountability, but to find a path beyond perpetual enmity. As Traoré departed the village, turning to the capital, and the countless challenges still facing his nation, he carried with him the image of children playing where once there had been only abandoned ruins. It was perhaps the most powerful testament to what becomes possible when leaders take unprecedented risks for peace, when the guns fall silent, and the difficult, essential work of reconciliation